Okay, thank you guys for having me. I know most of you. For those I don't know, look forward to meeting you at some point. Dave, how's the surf this morning?
Small.
Small? Yeah. Well, and if my dad and I truly built the post office, it would be long buried underneath the ground because he's never lifted a shovel in his entire life. Literally hasn't. So I haven't done a PowerPoint since college. But obviously, as Andy said, I was born and raised here in Ojai. I've got 3 kids. My youngest son will be 5 next week. And then I have a 7-year-old boy and a 11-year-old daughter. So I feel super fortunate to raise them here in Ojai as I was raised here. And you know, it was one of the main reasons we came back. My wife and I came back to Ojai. We didn't have kids at that point, but we wanted to raise our kids here in this town. So we really care about this town. I really care about this town. I love it, and I'm excited for hopefully the future of it with my kids. If they can ever afford to buy a house someday, we'll find out. So we'll start with just, I figured, you know, a lot of this data is coming from the Ojai MLS, so it's real data that we use every day. And then when we get into what's the market gonna, you know, what's the forecast for the future, it's my opinion. So I'm prefacing with an asterisk, of course. Who knows? And we'll talk about that when we get there. But I figured we'd start with just kind of what's happening in the market, look a little bit about what happened in the market previously, and then get into where we think it's going to go.
Point at the computer.
Oh, sorry.
Down.
Am I holding it upside down? It probably upside down.
There you go.
Okay. Anybody have a guess as to how many active properties are in the Ojai Valley? And this is residential only. I'm not looking at land or mobile homes. 22. 22 active in the entire Ojai Valley. That's from Oakview to Upper Ojai. And again, single family and condos. There's been an inventory crisis everywhere. We hear it on the news all the time. Ojai, it's exaggerated even more because we're always a small market. But I think traditionally, looking in the past, you know, I've been doing this is my 19th year in the business and selling real estate, and normally I'd say we'd have 80 to 120 active properties for sale in a normal market pre-COVID. So 22, I mean, you can imagine the reason we're seeing prices go up and the demand's there, the inventory's so low, it's just incredible. How many of the active are under $1 million? 2. There's 2 under $1 million, which, you know, a big reason for that is the ones under $1 million sell very, very quickly. And generally the ones over $1 million also sell quickly, but we just don't have this stagnant inventory. It's turning over so quickly that the active is not really reflective of there's only 2 for sale under $1 million. There is today, but there's several of them that are in contract now. So 50% of the active properties are 2 million plus. And the lowest price active listing is on Santa Ana Road. It's for $545,000. And of course you have the Black Mountain Ranch for $100 million. Quite a difference. Okay, so looking at the past, when you're trying to forecast and think about what the market's going to do, you know, traditionally, an economist would look at what's happened in the past. You look at the history, you follow the trends, you look at the graphs. COVID's obviously kind of flipped that upside down. So it's really difficult to forecast based on what's happened in the past. Normally, we'd look at the cycles, the 8 to 10 year cycles, as we saw in 2008 to 2011 or 12, the downturn, and some of that. So in 2005, which was kind of the peak of the volume, and the volume of sales, there were 344 sales in the Ojai Valley. 283 of them were less than $1 million. So again, it's all relative, obviously inflation factors and all those certain things. But 283 were less than $1 million, and 13 were over $2 million. That statistic today is going to be basically flipped, although there's still a lot more under $1 million. The average sale price in 2005 was $823,000. Looking at 2006, you've got 262 sales. So the volume started to come down. It was right before kind of the correction was happening, but the prices were going up. The average was $915. It jumped up almost $100,000 from the year before. There were 210 sales under $1 million, and there were 12 were greater than $2 million. So about the same in terms of the luxury market in Ojai. Now, looking at kind of the bottom when things corrected, that people want to compare what's going to happen in the real estate market now versus what happened in 2008. And of course, the dynamics of that market were completely different. I mean, I use myself as an example. Fresh out of college, got my real estate broker's license, sold a few friends' houses, had a little bit of money in the bank, but I walked in and I was starting a commercial real estate job in Santa Barbara. And I walked into Chase Bank, no, it was Washington Mutual at the time. And I said, there's a condo in Santa Barbara at $625,000. I want to buy it. And the guy, sitting there across the table, was a nice guy. Says, well, how much do you make? And I said, well, I'm actually just starting my career. And he said, well, how much do you think you're going to make? And that, again, and I take responsibility. I bought it. I was an adult at the time. But that kind of lending, which really created a lot of the crisis, the housing crisis, has obviously not been happening since the upswing starting in about 2012. So for any of you that have gotten a home refinanced, or if you've purchased a home in the last 10 years, you know how grueling it is. I mean, they're looking at every little inch of anything, they're questioning everything. So the dynamics of it are completely different. Did you have a question?
What would be the difference between the median and the average?
The median is obviously,
I know what it is.
yeah.
But I mean, what would it be?
We typically use the average. I don't have the exact median number. It'll be slightly below, the average.
Yeah.
But it's, for purposes of this, we're using the average as kind of our basis. Okay, and then basically, I think the peak of the downturn in 2011, the volume went up dramatically. There was 278 sales. 250 were under $1 million, the average price being $577. So that was the kind of the peak of the short sale market, which people were obviously owed more than the homes were worth, and it was Cherie remembers, I'm sure the process of those was not fun, and we hope we don't get back into a market like that anytime soon. Okay, the last 3 years, I think this is probably the most important indicator of, where the market likely will go. I mean, we look at the most recent data, obviously 2019 being just before the COVID crisis, so it gives you a sense of where the market was in a normal time, quote unquote, versus the COVID market, which flipped everything upside down. 268 sales in 2019, 193 were under $1 million, there were 15 over $2 million, pretty consistent in terms of what we saw previously before the downturn, an average price being just under $1,995,000. 2020, we saw 276 sales, so volume basically stayed the same. And 123 were less than $1 million, 35 were greater than $2 million, with an average price of $1,250,000. So we're seeing obviously the trend swinging upward. We all know that. We see it on all the markets have seen kind of that 20% growth through 2020. When COVID first kind of started, obviously we didn't know what was going to happen in the market. Nobody did. So, but it went to a screeching halt in kind of mid to late February into March, excuse me, and all of a sudden then, of course, the light switch turned on and the entire fabric of the real estate market shifted, unlike anything, of course, we've ever seen. And it now, because people were working remotely, or are working remotely, it allowed lifestyle communities like Ojai to become accessible, which they've never been accessible for those that have to be in an office environment. Obviously, we don't have a lot of industry here. So, thank you. So we started to see a lot of families move back in to Ojai, which I lived on Pleasant Street at the time between Daly and Drown, and we bought that in the downturn, and the entire time we were there for about 8 years, there were no families with kids on our street, none. We were the only family with kids, and we knew all the neighbors, and they were all great, but the kids were grown or they were in high school or college. And by the time we left in 2020, literally every house on both sides of us and across the street, 3 in a row, all had kids under 10. And they were all from out of the area. They were all working remotely. They all had the ability to do that. And of course, a lot of them capitalized on what was happening in the LA market, and prices were rising, and they were taking that equity and buying up in Ojai. But we did see a dramatic increase in families locally. That's what a lot of us have seen and talked about. I think the private schools have really benefited from that more so than the public schools. And I know, OVS, as an example, was, they were turning people away for some of the classes because they were full and they couldn't take any more kids. And I don't know the last time that's been an issue for them. So 2020, things really shifted and took off and went really crazy. 2021, before going into 2021, we thought, what's the market going to do? I mean, we're in the midst of COVID, things are chaotic with COVID, but the demand is still just, it's ramping up and ramping up. And of course, our luxury market really took off at that point. We started to see a lot of outside, incredible amounts of wealth come to town, and not anymore are they making it a second home or a vacation home. They're now oftentimes making it a primary home. And that's a shift from what we've seen in the past. Traditionally, the luxury market was a second home market in Ojai. That would be anything probably over $1.5 million. And nowadays, so many of them might keep the LA home or the San Francisco home, but they're making Ojai home base. And they're here for the lifestyle and all those pieces. And so that, a lot of small lifestyle-oriented towns like Ojai across the country have benefited from the same thing. So there were 269 sales last year. Again, very consistent with 2019, 2020 and 2021. 133 were less than $1 million. 61 were greater than $2 million. 61 with an average price of $1.5 million. And it was $1,495,000. But that's all data that has sold in the Ojai MLS with an average price of $1.5 million. So you see that the pricing trajectory and the sales price, it's incredible. And a lot of that is because of, like I said, people are continuing to work remotely. Companies have shifted how they do business, and it's really seemed to do really well. I don't think that's going away anytime soon. For some companies it will, but I think a lot of people have reprioritized where they want to be, where the security for their family, if they have kids, where they want to raise the kids. And if you don't have to be in LA in the midst of a pandemic, when you can't enjoy the benefits of living in a city with restaurants and shopping, it's not the best place in the world to live. So being that we're so accessible, we've seen a dramatic increase of obviously LA, as we all know. Especially West LA has been very common, San Francisco, and even New York and the East Coast. There's been a big influx of wealth from the East Coast. And again, as we go into some of these examples of properties, it's mind-blowing. Being in the business 19 years and growing up here, it's still hard for me, and Sheree and I talked about this as I was coming in. The pricing is, in many cases, doesn't make sense on paper, right? But we know that the demand is such and the inventory is such, and the outside wealth coming into town has been capitalizing on their market. And if they had a 1,500 square foot house in Venice Beach they sold for $3.5 million, and they come up to Ojai and go, I can get an acre and or half an acre and this 2,500 square foot house for $2.5 million, they think it's a bargain. So it's really hard for us to forecast the pricing, and when it's almost like every sale is setting a new bar, and it just keeps climbing and keep climbing. So here's an example of a house over here behind Vaughn's. Beautiful house. It's actually a 4-bedroom house, and it has a pool in the back. It was sold in 2015 for $549. So, on the upswing after the downturn. It was sold again in 2019 for $794. And a realtor who used to live here owned this house. And I remember talking to her, and she moved out of the area. She goes, I can't believe I almost got $800,000 for my house. And at the time, we're going, $800,000 for, a 4-bedroom tract house behind Vaughn's. It just, at the time, it seemed really high. It was pushing the boundary. Just went on the market again for $1,095,000. They have multiple offers. So they're likely going to get, it's in escrow now, so $1.1 million now for the 4-bedroom house in a great neighborhood, but behind Vaughn's for its 60s tract house. And so would we have predicted that a year ago? Absolutely not. I mean, it's really hard to follow that trajectory and kind of quantify how high it's going to go, because it's supply and demand based right now. And that really factors into, as we'll talk about here in a minute. Well, here's another example. 332 North Rice Road, very cute house in the Miners Oaks area, so it's Upper Rice Road. It's a half an acre. It's 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, and it does have an outbuilding and I think an Airstream. And they've hipstified it. It's kind of got that Venice cool vibe for the hipster group, and so we knew it would attract a lot of of younger, wealthier people coming up. And that was listed for, it sold in 2011 for $390,000. And granted, when the people bought it since then, of course, they've done lots of renovations. Everything's basically been redone. And it's listed for $1,495,000, and there is at least 8 offers on it. It went into contract. And the rumor is, I know somebody who wrote an offer at $1,800,000 and they didn't get it. So it went for over $1,800,000 for a half an acre with a 2-bedroom, 1.5 bath. Very charming. Again, it's completely done. And that's a big part of what the market's been doing. When you see these big premiums on a lot of houses, we call them suitcase buyers. They can come in, they buy it, they set their bags down, and they're done. And they can enjoy the lifestyle immediately. They don't want to deal with contractors. They don't want to deal with construction, the cost and the time and everything. So there's a huge market who will pay the premium or the top market value for something that's completely done. And they can just start enjoying it right away. So there's still some occasionally kind of value add deals out there if somebody's willing to take on doing some work. But we know through the COVID market, the construction costs have just skyrocketed. The cost of materials have skyrocketed. Labor's skyrocketed. So it's not as simple as just renovating a kitchen for $25,000 anymore. I mean, you'll be laughed at by every contractor in the valley. So all of those things have kind of played into the market, and again, with such a severe lack of inventory with 22 active properties. But noticing that, let me go back real quick. The volume in 2021, which everybody talked about, there's nothing for sale, there's no inventory. Just as many sales as there were in 2019, which we still consider a quasi low inventory market, but because things are turning over so quickly and there's so many sales happening off market that we actually had basically the same volume as before. We just don't have the stagnant inventory that's just sitting. So that's a big piece of it. It's even right now, 22 active properties again isn't a true reflection of the market. There's at least that or more that are in contract now. So January's finished out about the same where it did the last couple of years, and I think February volume-wise will probably finish out about the same too. Okay, so getting into, again, we just talked about this, the seller's market and buyer's market. Clearly, right now we're in the biggest seller's market in the history of real estate in this country. It's never before been such a seller's market where they can dictate the terms. The last buyer's market was obviously in the downturn going into 2010, and then as it started to pick up through 2011 and 12. So you've got complete, really opposite ends of the spectrum, the highest of the highs and the lowest of the lows of inventory, and within this last 10 years. So that's a kind of a scary statistic. You hope it's going to balance out and level off a little bit. Interest rates being a big factor in that, and obviously, as we saw so much wealth coming up here the last couple of years, and most of them still would leverage the interest rates because they considered it free money. If you can get a 30-year fix for 2.5%, well, they can take that $2 million and put it to work elsewhere and do a lot better than tying it up in the house. So that was a big factor also in allowing and making it, as prices were rising so high, and of course with inflation, it allowed people's mortgages to be manageable versus as the trending rates obviously are going up. We're seeing already they're about in the mid to upper 3s for a 30-year fixed if it's your primary residence. And the jumbo market actually is still a little bit better than the conventional market, but rates are definitely trending up. The Fed has announced, this year they're going to stop buying the mortgage-backed securities. That's going to be a big deal. Obviously, the only way they can entice investors to buy those is by bringing the rates up. So we're seeing that it's already happened, and so far it hasn't impacted the market at all. Last year, going into the end of the year, we thought once rates really started to tick up that it was going to make an immediate impact. It certainly hasn't done that. I mean, historically, I think the 50-year average is like 7.5% or something like that. So 3.5 to 3.75% is still a phenomenal rate. And that's what people are looking at for the bigger picture, kind of longer picture. But the trend line is that they're going to continue to go up. And I think by 2023, they're saying they'll probably be in the mid 4s to upper 4s, something like that. So they're going to raise it at probably a quarter basis point every quarter, something like that. And conforming, they raised recently, which is amazing, to 851,000. So if you get a loan of $851,000 or less, that's a conforming loan. And the downturn, it was like $417,500, I think is what it was, kind of at the peak of the downturn. So because prices have gone up, obviously, and with inflation and everything else, they've raised that conforming rate for Fannie and Freddie to buy those up to 851. Anything over 851 is a jumbo loan, again, which actually has better rates if you qualify for it. Buyers are leveraging the rates. Okay, forecasting, this is the thing. I mean, as I said, I'll share my opinion. Obviously, I don't have a crystal ball. And as somebody once told me, if I did, I wouldn't be a realtor. I'd be doing lots of other things. But this market, because of COVID, has obviously it's a new DNA for real estate. Everything's changed. Everything's different. It's the new normal. So you can't really try to correlate what's happened in the past and the up and downturns when we're really pioneering new territory with everything. Obviously, not just real estate. But overall, The Economist, if you Google, real estate market forecast 2022 or 2023, they're very bullish. They're very bullish. In fact, yesterday, let me go back to this one. Yesterday, this was up on Fortune.com. Home prices set to soar 12% in 2022, says a top forecaster, no end in sight. That's the trend of what you'll see if you research online what the economists are forecasting. There's so many factors that can change that. If obviously a war, that can change the market. Of course, a massive stock market correction could change the market. But traditionally, real estate's always been the best hedge against inflation. So I think a lot of people are still prioritizing where they want to be for their families and lifestyle over necessarily what's the best investment choice. And so I think that's a big reason why the market is going to likely trend positive this year. I think this was for 2021, and they forecasted the volume in 2021 to be way higher than really any previous year. I don't know if it quite hit that number, but the 2022 forecast is actually even higher in terms of the forecasted sales volume. So I think they think the pricing is not going to obviously appreciate like it has year over year the last several years, but that we're still going to see an appreciation rate. I think they said about 6.6% was the average they were forecasting, and that the volume is actually going to be higher than it was last year. I think a lot of us who have been in the business and we watch the cycles, again, if things stay how they are now with the supply and demand, the low supply and very high demand, and rates are sub 4.5, then yes, this year will likely finish very strong. But I think as we get closer to when the Fed stop buying the mortgage-backed securities in the midsummer going into the third quarter, that's going to be the telltale sign of what's to come in the market. And I think it's going to likely stay very strong up until then. But after that, this is what The Economist actually said. So with more housing inventory to hit the market, the intense multiple offers will start to ease. He's one of the top economists for the National Association of Realtors. Home prices will continue to rise, but at a slower pace, which is good. That's far more of a healthy market. Young projects that mortgage rates will increase to 3.77 in 2022, which they basically already have for the most part, pushed up persistently higher inflation. The last thing he said was affordability will increasingly be a challenge as interest rates and prices rise, but remote work may expand search areas and enable younger buyers to find their first-time homes sooner than they might have otherwise. Affordability is a whole other factor in Ojai that isn't part of this discussion, but the challenge I see obviously is can they make living wages to afford to live here? And what we've seen with the rental market is it's correlated pretty much directly with housing prices. And now the average 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in downtown Ojai is $3,500 a month. And so for most people, if you've got 20% down, which not everybody does, but if you've got 20% down, your mortgage payment's going to be cheaper than your rent payment. And that's rare. Historically, that hasn't always been the case. Of course, there's write-offs and benefits of home ownership, future appreciation, but if your mortgage payment is less than your rent, it's a telltale sign of what's going on in the markets. And that's the trend for rentals is the same. I mean, there's very few houses for rent in town, and when they do come up, they seem to have a big market for them, and so that's driven prices up even higher. And it's scary to think. I mean, I remember when I came back to Ojai in 2007, I rented a house over in Mirror Lake, and I think it was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, and it was like, James owned it, $1,450 a month, I think it was, in 27 or 28. And that same house now is getting $3,600 a month. So in a matter of 12 years, 14 years, it's tripled, basically. And that's hard to keep up with. I know for a lot of people, raising a family here, putting your kids in school, all of those things, it's difficult. So I don't know where Ojai's going to go with that. And we'll be curious to see if there is a correction in the sales market, how that does really impact the rental market. I don't think it's going to impact it much because, again, we're such a low supply market anyways. We don't have new development. We're not going to see KB Homes building 50 houses, in town. It's not going to happen. So that's going to keep our supply level always lower than the average. Ojai obviously is not going away in terms of, I think it's always gone through phases. Some movie star would move up here 20 years ago and they would get some press and you get some people come up and then they'd leave and our quiet little town would kind of remain quiet. And we've all seen what's shifted and happened, not because of the real estate market, but because of the influence into this town. And Ojai is now recognized all over the world, which is good and bad. Again, raising kids here, it gets a little hectic on weekends, but with that comes opportunity for business owners and to be able to thrive and to do what they do, and great restaurants to have in town, all that sort of thing. So I don't think Ojai's a fad. I think it truly is going to be here to stay. It's everybody I've worked with from out of town is always, I check in with them, a couple times a year, and they're just so grateful to live in this town. And they're so happy that, it's February and it's 80 degrees, but that their kids get to go to school here, or they get to retire and spend their days hiking and enjoying what we all enjoy about town. And so the demand's always going to stay for Ojai. And when we always have the demand and you've got a limited supply, no matter what the market does, we're somewhat insulated from any sort of massive correction compared to the macro world. Of course, easy access to the city of LA, that's always a big thing. They want to be able to get to the airports easily. And for them to go to Santa Barbara is an extra 45 minutes, 40 minutes for them to get to LA. So there's a big influence for that. Unless they're flying, private out of Santa Barbara, those factors do play into them wanting to come here. The weather, of course, which hopefully we get some more rain, because we all know we need that. And I think the last thing, as I'm telling all clients, friends, and family, it's still a great time to buy a house. If people sometimes get focused and hung up on, am I paying the top of the market? Well, if you've got a longer term outlook and a 3 to 5 year plan, you're really insulated from likely any correction. And the benefits of the interest rates you capture today versus what they'll be in 3 to 5 years for the long run far outweighs, any sort of pricing correction. Because we all know if there's a correction, it'll likely be a much different correction than 2008. It'll be a much softer landing. We'll have more inventory. It'll be more of a buyer's market, but that doesn't mean prices are going to just plummet. They could. Again, who knows what could trigger that? But I think for a 3 to 5 year plan, it's still a great time to buy. If somebody says, well, I may, live here for a year and then I might sell, and I'd say, well, listen, there's an added risk element, right? We've been on an upswing for about 10 years now, and historically, the 8 to 10 year cycle, there's got to be some point when we do see some form of a correction. And I think that the risk is such that, I'd suggest them considering renting if it's just going to be for a year. But if they have a 3 to 5 year commitment level, it's a phenomenal time to buy. I just bought again a year and a half ago, and feel fortunate to be able to have done that and capture the rates and all those things. So with that, I think that's it. I can answer any questions. And thank you for having me.